Steve, tell us about yourself.
I'm Steve Shepard, and I used to work at MITS. MITS was a company here in Albuquerque that made the Altair computer, which you see to my right here. And their name originally stood for Micro Instrumentation and Telemetry Systems. Later on, they just changed it to simply MITS as a word.
We're in the Startup Gallery at the New Mexico Museum of Natural History and Science. Can you tell us about the Startup Gallery?
The Startup Gallery here at the museum is concerned about the history of the personal computer from the first commercially successful personal computer, which was made here in Albuquerque, and which was the MITS Altair 8800. And it goes on through more modern day computers, the IBM PC and the Apple Macintosh, and everything in between. There are movies here, videos concerning those subjects. And also, it's a lot about the beginnings of Microsoft, who is closely tied with MITS and the first computer. Microsoft got their beginnings by writing MITS BASIC for the Altair computer. And it was the original high-level language that was available for personal computers, or microcomputers, they called them back then. Both companies started in Albuquerque, and both companies became fairly famous, and they made our city famous.
You mentioned the fact that the first commercially successful personal computer was created here in Albuquerque by a company named MITS. Could you tell us more about MITS and how they got into the computer business?
MITS started out, it was started by mainly the main person who's gone down in history is Ed Roberts. And it started out as a company that made electronics packages for model rocketry. They made telemetry and strobe lights and things like that for model rockets. Then they got into the manufacture of a lot of hobbyist kits, laser transmitters and receivers, calculators, test equipment, electronics test equipment, and then ultimately they got into the computer business when all those other incomes started to fail. The calculator business was extremely lucrative at the beginnings, but you may remember that prices dropped from $400 to $10 in just a couple of years for a calculator. So it almost made MITS go bankrupt. And so they looked around for something else to do, and they came up with the Altair computer.
What role did you have at MITS?
I was a field service engineer for MITS, and my main function was to go to all of our customer sites in New Mexico, Arizona, southern Colorado, and keep things running. If the customer couldn't mail their equipment in to have it repaired, I could go to their site and repair it. If I was not in the field, I would take all the incoming technical phone calls, or most of them, that came into the repair facility. And I talked to a lot of different countries. At the time, there wasn't a huge customer base, so you could afford to talk to customers one-on-one a lot of times, and that's what I did.
Once the Altair was introduced, it became a huge success, practically overnight. Soon, however, there was a flood of other personal computers on the market. How was MITS affected once they found themselves in a crowded PC market?
Sales went down. I suppose it forced MITS to come up with better machines. There was not just the original 8800 computer. There were also several newer models. The 8800B was the final version, and it was infinitely better than the original. And a lot of its design may have been caused because of competition. Other people had come out with other machines that were better than the original 8800. IMSAI, IMSAI, is a company that built what's usually considered to be the first clone computer. It was a clone of the Altair. And they sold a lot of those models until the Altair 8800B came out, and then the B was again the better machine.
A little known fact is that Microsoft started here in Albuquerque. Did you know Bill Gates or Paul Allen?
No, I didn't know either one of them. I'm sure we passed in the halls, but I didn't know either one of them. They were in separate departments, well, even separate companies, really, but we all worked out of the same building at first. And I was even in a separate building for a good part of the time that I worked for MITS, so no, I didn't know them. And I'm sure they don't know me.
Can you tell us whatever happened to the Altair?
MITS was bought out by a company called Pertec Computer Corporation. And Pertec Computer Corporation was a big company out of California that wanted to become a big conglomerate company that owned a lot of smaller companies. Unfortunately, they didn't know how to handle a microcomputer company because it was a cutting-edge thing that nobody had ever done before. And that's ultimately why MITS went out of business. They stopped production of the Altair, even though there was still a strong customer base for it. They tried to introduce some new models that they had more or less had a hand in developing, and those models never sold well. Eventually, they decided to just shut down the Albuquerque operation that they had spent millions of dollars to buy. So that's what happened to the Altair. It just got canceled.
When did MITS Pertec go out of business, and what happened to the former employees?
MITS closed their doors in 1978, and about 300 people or so were left jobless because of that. A lot of people went to Digital Equipment Corporation here in town. Sperry, I believe, was in business at the time, and they hired a lot of people.
Not long after the demise of MITS, Microsoft left Albuquerque for Seattle. There are many stories floating around as to why they did this. Can you give us your take?
Well, the story had always been that they could not get funding from the local bankers, and they were more or less forced to go back to Washington where they had connections. However, the official story from Microsoft is that they just wanted to go back home, and it had nothing to do with financing. So I guess you have to go with the official story, and that is that they just were homesick.
Broadly speaking, what effect did the Altair have on the direction of personal computers, and what things would be different if the Altair or MITS had never existed?
MITS started the personal computer revolution, if you want to call it that, and it eventually would have happened, but it probably would have been delayed by several years if it weren't for MITS. They more or less demonstrated that it could be done, and they did it pretty well for the time. They also started the first computer magazine. It was mostly an in-house magazine called Computer Notes, but it also talked about other products. They started what was the prelude to the Comdex computer shows around the world with the World Altair Computer Convention. That was the first personal computer exhibition. They were the first people to write business software for a personal computer. And some of the companies involved in that, or the offshoots, still exist today. So they had a lot to do with the development of the PC as it is today, and the development of the business world as it is today.
Looking into the future, where do you see personal computers going in the next 5 to 10 years?
I don't know. I cannot guess that far in the future, really. Things change so fast. But I'll probably own one of whatever it is that's out there 5 or 10 years from now.
I presume that, as a child, you were into electronics. Looking back, did you ever foresee a time when nearly everyone would have access to a personal computer?
No, I didn't. And in fact, of course, until the Altair came out in the mid-'70s, the only kind of computers there were big mainframes like the Univacs and the IBMs and big things like that. And as a science fiction fan, I notice now that there were never any references to personal computers in science fiction from back before the 1970s. So I really had no way of anticipating what things were going to be like when I was younger.
Can you tell us the reason you became a volunteer here at the Startup Gallery?
The reason I wanted to become a volunteer here was just I think this is a pretty interesting way to present the history of the PC to people who really don't know much about it. It's a good project, and I just wanted to help out somehow. So that's the reason I'm doing it, and I can help by doing things like this today, and by telling people who visit the museum a little more about the history.
Thank you for your time.